This is a tutorial analysing Chapter 1 of Margaret Atwood's novel, The Handmaid's Tale. The novel hasn't been out of print since publication in 1985, and this says something of its power to speak to us as a society and as an individual. It's quite often categorised as science fiction, but also speculative fiction and dystopian literature. We'll talk about this in more detail once we've read a few chapters of the novel. So we're going to run through how to analyse and how to annotate, looking at Chapter 1 today. So let's start by looking at the title of Chapter 1, Night. As we begin Chapter 1 of any novel, we quite often look at the function of the exposition or the opening chapters. What should these establish? What expectations do we have of novels and the way they work, the way that they begin, the way that they develop ideas and the way that they end? And which of those categories does this seem to fit? We'll look closely at structure. What expectations do we have of the structure of a novel? And as we respond to each part of the novel, we carry those understandings with us to the next chapter and the next, thus shaping our reading. The section title of Night is significant if we think about the connotations we have of night. The ending of a day, the ending of something significant, darkening, the tone or the mood that creates. The title of the parts is important because each of these sections has a group of chapters that relate to each other. So we want to look at what that link and what that significance is. So let's begin with Chapter 1. On reading Chapter 1, we'd like you to pause and answer these questions, looking out for key quotes that provide evidence for your views. So first of all, is the novel's present our future? And what links can we draw between the two contexts? What is the world of the text and which elements seem familiar to us? What would you say is valued in this world based on the observations of our protagonist? Consider the representations of power. Who or what is powerful and powerless? Who has given them this power or who has stripped them of it? What suggestions can we draw that indicate the fate of those who resist the world order and what freedoms that we enjoy seem to be missing? You might even consider the Giver or the Truman Show if you've studied these texts. How does Chapter 1 sustain an atmosphere of nostalgia, loss and oppression? What could be the significance of giving a voice to a protagonist who clearly has no voice and no say in her context? And what themes and issues are conveyed here? Despite not knowing the specific identity of our protagonist, our storyteller, we are encouraged to respond with compassion, questions, disbelief, and possibly offence or contempt. How does Atwood achieve this? Through elements of structure, style, and the sci-fi dystopian genre. So far, what traits or characterise this voice for you? From what position is the story being told? Why might Atwood depict the protagonist reflecting on the past before ending the chapter with commentary on the present? And how does this structure or order position us to respond to the information provided? And finally, what is the significance of a one-chapter part? How might this serve as a prologue or introduction to the main ideas, characters, and setting of the text? So we'll return to these at the end of the chapter. So as we begin reading Chapter 1, we'll notice that there are some very specific details being observed. There is an immediate use of past tense and reference to time past in the discussion of the gymnasium and the description of the sweat and the chewing gum, the miniskirts, the pants, the spiky green streaked hair, the dance, the garlands of tissue paper, and the powdering the dancers with a snow of light. It raises questions for us. Why are they sleeping in a gymnasium? Who are we? Has there been some kind of emergency or disaster that prevents people from returning to their homes and families? Like any good science fiction, it begins with a what if, it begins with a question, and leaves us wanting more. We also take note of the imagery of games, childhood, teams, and the net's now gone. What else has changed? Pause to note these things down. Investigate the palimpsest and the implication that no matter how rigid the regime, it cannot fully erase one's original identity or history. We also importantly get the introduction of I, our protagonist, who it seems is part of the we, the first line of the chapter. The voice guiding our insight into a future time and place. As said, the references to dancers, cardboard cutouts, and the ball of mirrors evokes a scene of a ball or a dinner dance, young love, felt skirts, and miniskirts, innocence of 1950s. There's a nostalgic tone. Why begin in this way? What effect does that have? Paragraph 2 emphasises this yearning for a lost past, a physical connection, instinctiveness, even love, youth on the cusp of adulthood and individuality, the rite of passage as we come to learn who we are. It is a yearning for the future. There's something about to happen, and is an interesting use of language and description. There's a desire for change, for possibility, hope, maybe something better. It invites us to question what is wrong with the now. Why are they feeling so unfulfilled? And are some things being denied? We move on to paragraph 3, which begins, we yearned for the future. Paragraph 3 continues to juxtapose the present and past, suggesting that these are inextricably linked. They cannot be separated. One informs the other. And the contrast serves to highlight the changes, the things that seem to be lacking in the present for our narrator. There is imagery of childhood, innocence, and adulthood in the contrast between children's flannelette sheets, possibly a sign of comfort, and the army cots. The outcome of this deliberate disparity, this incongruence, it's not a fun camp, it's not a sleepover, it's not temporary. Something major has occurred. This merges effectively into connotations of conformity, sacrifice of independence and individuality. There are rigid time frames and bed checks, just as we'd experience in the army. Again, this forms questions. Who is in control? Who or what granted them authority over the protagonist and his or her group? We read the reference about Aunt Sarah and Elizabeth patrolling with electric cattle prods slung on thongs from their belts. This seems familiar at first, this identity, this terminology of aunt, connotations of family, love and support are evoked. But when you couple this with the use of patrolled and electric cattle prods, this diction takes on a much more sinister meaning or effect. Again, like any good dystopic or science fiction text, questions are raised regarding the human condition, power and control, and possibly totalitarianism. We learn later that it's a theocracy. The cattle metaphor evokes connotations of conformity, mindlessness, inferiority and control, a source to be used for food or sustenance for the majority, and certainly a lack of individual choice or free will. Paragraph 4 serves to reinforce this powerlessness of the we or us in the face of these guards. The angels, the reference to chain link fences and barbed wire, several powerful elements are operating here to encourage question after question from the modern reader, and one that would be used to science fiction texts. Why are they not allowed out? Who decides when and where they will exercise their mobility, their free will? In keeping with the rest of the chapter, paragraph 4 raises more questions such as, how is it that the angels, and all the connotations associated there, can be objects of fear? What does this paradox suggest? And how is the novel already subverting common associations and assumptions we have with such imagery and faith? The categorising of people as a means of defining identity in a social or functional way, guards and the capitalised proper noun the angels, is significant. And we see that there is largely a tone that is clinical and unemotional. Finally, paragraph 5 uses diction again, that specific word choice, to evoke the night of the chapter title, with reference to whisper, the semi-darkness, touching each other's hands across space and darkness. On the surface, the image is of school-age campers, homesick for family and touching. But the deeper realisation and subsequent naming of female characters that these adults denied human contact and conversation and are yearning for a freedom of speech and self-determination that has been taken is disturbing, to say the least. Grown women are reduced to children whispering against the rules in the dark in a former gymnasium and shrouded in metaphorical and literal darkness, desperate for a sign of connection and uniqueness. What has happened to humanity? Interestingly, to end the chapter, the women's names Alma, Janine, Dolores, Moira and June also evoke an earlier time in American history, an innocent time that's often romanticised and celebrated fondly. Without even knowing the specific identity or category of the we or us referenced from the very beginning of the chapter, we leave this chapter feeling we understand their need to escape secrecy and imprisonment, and their almost animalistic yearning for feeling and freedom, particularly if all they have left with which to barter for basic freedoms is their body, if only. So pause to return to these questions and jot down, as I said, those very important quotes that provide evidence for your views. You might like to make a table of those genre categories that were mentioned at the start: science fiction, speculative fiction, and dystopian literature, and list the evidence underneath each, and perhaps have a discussion with your class as to which category you feel best suits this novel. Look at how the past and the present for our protagonist are linked, and for the reader, our present and possible future, that seems to be a regression in attitudes and time, rather than a progression or advancement. And lastly, compare the world of the protagonist with our current world. The effectiveness of a sci-fi's what if is increased if we can make some direct links with our existing world. So what do you see that sounds or looks familiar? And what do you see has changed? Also note down what might have caused such changes. What can we envision from our context that might lead to that regression in attitudes and categorising and possibly misogynistic attitudes towards certain groups in society. Now move on to the lecture for Chapter 2.